Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Imagine paying to enter a country and still being treated like an outsider. These words echo the bitter reality faced by thousands of Chinese immigrants who arrived in Canada during the IBI, late 19th and early 20th centuries. They came in search of opportunity, having contributed immensely to projects like the Canadian Pacific Railway, yet were met not with gratitude, but with a heavy price, literally. The Chinese head tax, a deeply discriminatory policy, forced Chinese immigrants to pay a fee just to enter the country, making Canada one of the few nations in the world to place such a financial barrier based solely on ethnicity. This video explores the origins and enforcement of the Chinese head tax, a dark reflection of the racial prejudice that once shaped, and in some ways still echoes through, Canadian immigration policy. We'll dive into how and why this law came to be, hear powerful stories from families who lived through it, and uncover the long-term consequences it left behind. This isn't just about numbers or old policies, it's about real people, real suffering, and a nation coming to terms with its past. In the mid-19th century, many Chinese immigrants were drawn to Canada by the promise of opportunity. The discovery of gold during the Fraser River Gold Rush in the 1850s attracted those hoping to build a new life. Later, the Canadian government and businesses needed a large workforce to complete one of the country's most ambitious projects, the Canadian Pacific Railway. Chinese laborers, known for their hard work and willingness to endure harsh conditions, became essential to the railway's construction, especially through the treacherous Rocky Mountains. However, while their labor was highly valued, Chinese immigrants were seen by many white Canadians as a threat to jobs and social order. As their numbers grew, so did suspicion and resentment, fueled by racial stereotypes and fear of cultural differences. This rising anti-Asian sentiment created a climate where exclusionary policies became politically popular. Pressure mounted to control and limit Chinese immigration, setting the stage for laws that would impose heavy financial burdens on those seeking to enter Canada and ultimately restrict their presence in Canadian society. The Chinese head tax was born out of this toxic combination of economic need and racial prejudice. The Chinese head tax was a government-imposed fee introduced in 1885 specifically targeting Chinese immigrants. Initially set at $50, a significant sum at the time, the tax was designed to discourage Chinese people from coming to Canada. Over the years, this fee increased dramatically, reaching as high as $500 by 1903, which was roughly equivalent to 2 years' wages for many laborers. This steep financial barrier was not about raising revenue, but about limiting Chinese immigration through economic exclusion. The underlying rationale was clear: the tax was a tool of racial exclusion. Unlike other immigrant groups, Chinese newcomers were singled out and forced to pay this punitive fee simply because of their ethnicity. It was a stark example of systemic discrimination embedded in Canadian law, sending a message that Chinese people were unwelcome and considered outsiders. The Chinese head tax wasn't just a fee. It was a deliberate strategy to control the demographic makeup of the country and to keep Chinese communities small and marginalized. Visual records from this era, such as official tax certificates, government documents, and photographs of early Chinese Canadians, reveal both the bureaucratic coldness of the policy and the human faces behind it. These images help us understand the real impact of a law that affected thousands of lives and shaped the social fabric of Canada for decades. Life under the Chinese head tax was marked by deep hardship, not only financially but emotionally and socially. For many Chinese immigrants, paying the tax often meant arriving in Canada with nothing left: no savings, no safety net, and no realistic way to bring loved ones with them. The cost was simply too high. As a result, countless men came to Canada alone, working long hours in laundries, restaurants, and railway camps, while their wives and children remained in China, sometimes for decades, sometimes forever. This separation tore families apart. Letters carried hope, but also sorrow, as husbands missed the births of their children and grew old without seeing them grow. Some never reunited. These fractured lives left a lasting impact on generations, with descendants speaking of the emotional scars and cultural disconnection caused by these long absences and forced isolations. Beyond personal loss, Chinese immigrants faced constant social stigma. They were treated as perpetual foreigners, denied the rights and respect given to white Canadians. They lived in segregated communities, endured verbal and physical abuse, and were often scapegoated during economic downturns. The head tax wasn't just a policy, it was a symbol of how deeply embedded racism was in the fabric of Canadian society at the time. Today, families of those who paid the tax remember the pain and perseverance of their ancestors. Their stories, whether passed down through quiet conversations or preserved in old photographs and letters, speak to a legacy of resilience in the face of state-sanctioned exclusion. Interviews or reenacted accounts of these experiences help us hear the voices that history once tried to silence. The Chinese head tax was only the beginning of Canada's harsh immigration restrictions against Chinese people. In 1923, the Canadian government took its discrimination even further by passing the Chinese Immigration Act, more infamously known among Chinese Canadians as the Exclusion Act. This new law essentially banned all Chinese immigration to Canada. Only a handful of exceptions were made for diplomats, students, and merchants, but for the vast majority, entry into the country became legally impossible. The act came into effect on July 1, 1923, a date that Chinese communities would come to refer to not as Canada Day, but as Humiliation Day. For them, it was a painful reminder that they were deliberately shut out of the nation they had helped build. Families already separated by the head tax now faced complete isolation, with no legal pathway to reunite. Communities dwindled and hope faded. This exclusion lasted for 24 years, only being repealed in 1947. But by then, generations had already lived with the devastating effects of forced separation and institutionalized racism. The Exclusion Act didn't just stop immigration, it cemented a legacy of exclusion that would take decades to begin to undo. After World War II, Canada began to reconsider some of its most discriminatory policies, including the Chinese Immigration Act. In 1947, under growing international pressure and changing public attitudes, the exclusion law was finally repealed. But while Chinese immigrants were once again allowed to enter the country, the damage had already been done. Families had been kept apart for decades, and generations had endured legalized racism and social exclusion. The road to justice was long and difficult. Chinese Canadian communities across the country organized, campaigned, and lobbied for redress. Activists gathered petitions, shared personal stories, and met with political leaders to demand not only an apology, but also acknowledgement of the harm caused by the Head Tax and Exclusion Act. It took decades of persistent effort before the government formally responded. In 2006, Prime Minister Stephen Harper issued an official apology in the House of Commons on behalf of the Canadian government. He acknowledged the injustice of the head tax and the exclusionary policies that followed. The apology was accompanied by a symbolic gesture. Surviving head taxpayers or their spouses were offered a one-time payment of $20,000. For many, this moment was deeply emotional, a long overdue recognition of the pain their families had endured. But for others, the gesture felt incomplete. Thousands of families had no surviving claimants, and broader compensation for descendants or the community as a whole was not provided. The apology, while meaningful, raised questions about whether true justice had been served. Within the Chinese Canadian community, reactions were mixed. Gratitude for the recognition, frustration over the limitations, and a continued call to ensure such policies are never repeated. The fight for redress wasn't just about the past. It was about shaping a more just and inclusive future. The legacy of the Chinese Head Tax and Exclusion Act continues to shape Canada's identity and immigration policy to this day. These laws forced the country to confront the consequences of legislated racism and laid the groundwork for more inclusive reforms in the decades that followed. Canada's modern immigration system, though not perfect, was gradually rebuilt on principles of equality and multiculturalism, in part because of the hard lessons learned from this dark chapter. Yet the relevance of this history is not confined to the past. During the COVID-19 pandemic, a disturbing rise in anti-Asian hate reminded many of the same harmful stereotypes and scapegoating tactics that once fueled the head tax and exclusionary laws. It became clear that the wounds of the past can resurface if they are not fully acknowledged and addressed. Recognizing historical injustices is more than an act of remembrance. It's a vital step toward healing and progress. When a nation is willing to face its mistakes, it strengthens the bonds of its diverse communities and reaffirms its commitment to justice. The story of the Chinese head tax is not just about what happened, but about what must never happen again. By learning from the past, we empower ourselves to build a future rooted in dignity, inclusion, and mutual respect. The story of the Chinese head tax is a powerful reminder of how government policies can shape lives, for better or worse. We've explored why Chinese immigrants came to Canada, how they were singled out by discriminatory laws like the head tax and the Exclusion Act, and the long struggle for justice that followed. We've also seen how the effects of these injustices still echo today. As you reflect on this history, we invite you to think about your own family's journey. Did your ancestors face similar barriers? What stories have been passed down, and what stories still need to be told? And most importantly, ask yourself, what does justice really look like decades after the harm has been done? Is an apology enough? Or is there more that needs to be done to truly make things right? If this story moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. Share your thoughts, your family's experiences, or any lesser-known stories from Canadian history you think deserve to be heard. There are many more chapters like this waiting to be uncovered, and we're just getting started.